Whimbox. Gareth's Whimbox. It's Gareth's Whimbox. It's Gareth Whimbox. Thank you, Metal Gareth. That was energetic, but there's a reason for that intro. This is Welcome to Gareth's Whimbox, episode 7, and the theme of this Whimbox is metal. Metal. I don't do the growling Cookie Monster style very well, so I do the sort of whispered growl, and then I go into a what I've always it's Mike Patton essentially doing a very, very bad version of the versatility of Mike Patton was what I was doing, but that should become reason. So this is Gareth Whimbox, episode 7, special edition on metal. So our word of the day is going to be metal. Our word of the day is going to be metal. So metal from the Oxford English Dictionary, long definitions. Any member of the class of substances represented by gold, silver, copper, iron, lead, and tin, and originally confined to these bodies together with certain alloys. In chemistry, the metals are a division of the elements or simple substances. Of these, some possess all the properties such as high specific gravity and density, fusibility, malleability, etc., formerly viewed as a characteristic of a metal, while others possess hardly any of them, the metallic lustre being perhaps the most constant. In popular language, not applied when the identity of the element is disguised in combination. That's the definition of metal. But metallurgists, turn off now. This is not going to be about metal, it's going to be about metal. Heavy metal in particular, and all the subgenres of heavy metal. Heavy metal music from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Heavy metal, a genre of rock music that includes a group of related styles that are intense, virtuosic and powerful, driven by the aggressive sounds of the distorted electric guitar. Heavy metal is arguably the most commercially successful genre of rock music. This is interesting. Although the origin of the term heavy metal is widely attributed to the novelist William Burroughs, its use actually dates well back into the 19th century when it referred to a canon or to power more generally. It has also been used to classify certain elements or compounds, as in the phrase heavy metal poisoning. Heavy metal appeared in the lyrics of Steppenwolf's Born to be Wild, 1968. And by the early 1970s, rock critics were using it to refer to a specific style of music. Mid-60s British bands such as Cream, the Yardbirds, and the Jeff Beck Group, rest in peace, Jeff Beck, along with Jimi Hendrix, rest in peace again, are generally credited with developing the heavier drums, bass, and distorted guitar sounds that differentiate heavy metal from other blues-based rock. The new sound was codified in the 1970s by Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, with the release of Led Zeppelin 2, Deep Purple in Rock, and Paranoid, respectively, which feature heavy riffs, distorted power chords, some of which you heard at the beginning of this piece, mystical lyrics, guitar and drum solos, and vocal styles that range from the wails of Zeppelin's Robert Plant to the whines of Sabbath's Ozzy Osbourne. By developing increasingly elaborate stage shows and touring incessantly throughout the 1970s to make up for their lack of radio airplay, bands such as Kiss, AC/DC, Aerosmith, Judas Priest, and Alice Cooper established an international fan base. And the article goes on to talk about 70s, 80s, and stuff. Heavy metal musicians and fans came under severe criticism as the last political and academic groups sprang up to blame the genre and its fans for causing everything from crime and violence to despondency and suicide. But defenders of the music pointed out that there's no evidence that heavy metal's exploration of madness and horror caused, rather than articulated, these social ills. Very, very interesting. Did it cause or articulate? What is the did the riff come before the grift, or did the riff come before the dearth, oh, I don't know, whatever. Did the chicken come before the eggs? The genre's lyric and imagery have long addressed a wide range of topics, and its music has always been more varied and virtuosic than critics like to admit. Well done, Encyclopedia Britannica. It certainly is. Metal is certainly varied, virtuosic, and incredibly interesting, more than its critics like to admit. So this show, brought to you on the 16th of March, 2023, is a special edition. And it's special because I have a guest. I have a guest in a friend called Sam Solomon, who I'm going to introduce in a minute. So, welcome to episode 7 of Gareth Whimbox, all about metal. Recording in progress. Okay, so, right. Imagine the scene. It's 1991. An 11-year-old Gareth, feeling his superior maturity to the other kids around his age, wants to hang out with his eldest sister. She is 16, and she has cool friends with long hair, leather jackets, some of these leather jackets, which had cut-off denim over the top. They had skin-tight jeans and what was described as winkle pickers, which I think still exist somewhere. Some have earrings, one or two long ones dangling from one ear and studs all over the other. On their smelly jackets are sewn patches of band names with curly lettered names, skulls, demons, supernatural forces, and horror imagery. In Bristol, during that time, the scene of this childhood that I'm describing, my sister's friends were called jitters. Jitters, which you say in a Bristolian accent, jitters, which I think other other places might have had greasies, or anyway. But in Bristol, it was jitters. I don't know what that stands for. Probably, I think it means that they were vibrating with something. Anyway, it wasn't. It was a pejorative term. But I wanted to be them. I wanted to know their music. And listening to this music, my sister informed me this is metal, and I wanted a piece of it. So I bought a guitar. I picked up my school's guitar, borrowed records, cassettes, and CDs from my sister's friends. I went to rock and metal nights at the Beer Keller and the Thekla in Bristol. And I let the music take over me. Black Sabbath, Metallica, Megadeth, Pantera, Sepultura. So these were my entrance bands. But there was also the sublime oddity to me of a band called Faith No More. And particularly Faith No More of the Real Thing era from 1989 onwards. And with the prolifically talented Mike Patton on vocals and one of my heroes, Jim Martin, on guitar. And to this day, they're live at Brixton Academy, which I'm showing to my friend Sam on the screen at the moment, it's sort of my Madeline. You know, it sends me back to this extraordinary era. And I've just name dropped him, but I have sitting in front of me on my screen Sam Thomas, who I'm going to introduce you to now. But the segue I'm going to go into introducing Sam is, do you remember, Sam, when you made me a mixtape called Patton's Faces?
I have a dim recollection of that. Yeah. No, that's forging some connections somewhere. Yeah.
So with me today I have Sam Thomas, who's a lecturer, Dr. Samuel Thomas. Do we call you Sam or Samuel officially?
Sam is great.
Dr. Sam Thomas, who's at Durham University, and who we briefly shared air and brick at Sussex University. And yes, a long time ago, Sam and I didn't necessarily go in the same circles, but I remember him finding out about my love of metal, and somebody told me that he had this person was at Sussex who had an extraordinary sort of encyclopedic knowledge of metal. And you very kindly made me a couple of mixtapes, but one of them was Mike Patton's Faces, and you introduced me to the extraordinary range of his music. Are you still sort of into Mike Patton? Is he still an influence on yours?
Yes, and look, for better or worse, if there is one musician that's consistently shaped the way I hear, and sort of how and why I listen, that sort of informed the way I kind of collect music and what I'm seeking in music, then it's probably Patton and sort of related musicians through Faith No More, through Mr. Bungle, especially. I have like a real serious relationship with projects kind of taken forward beyond Mr. Bungle, led by Trace Bruance, the guitarist in Mr. Bungle, and by Trevor Dunn, the bass player. But yeah, Patton's always there in the background. I'm always interested in what Patton is doing, and it's kind of interesting now that Mr. Bungle have just returned to their kind of earliest metal roots, right? Like putting out, a re-recorded version of their 80s demo, this kind of, outsider thrash, the raging wrath of the Easter Bunny with Lombardo and Scott Ian. So there's something about that kind of coming full circle that I'm still kind of mulling over. But
well, for those of you who are listening, the legions of people who are listening, this is why I asked Sam to come to this podcast to talk about metal, because many of those names that Sam referenced I don't know. and I want to learn from him, but this is the type of knowledge that I'm going into. Before I introduce your work, what do you think of that Faith No More era that I was describing, the Real Thing era? Because before that there was a number of albums with another singer, other breakups. But I think the Patton era for me is just because maybe I'm sentimental about it, but that seems to me to be the pinnacle of what they were doing. But what do we think?
Yeah, actually, in recent years, it's interesting. I've actually developed a real appreciation for kind of pre-Patton Faith No More, for those early records with Chuck Mosley.
Is it We Care a Lot? And
We Care a Lot and Introduce Yourself.
Yeah, Introduce Yourself. Great song as well.
So some incredible songs, and I think Chuck Mosley is R.I.P. is an underrated and kind of highly idiosyncratic frontman, but clearly Patton takes them to into a whole new kind of dimension, and personally I'm torn actually. My favorite Faith No More album would probably be King for a Day. Actually,
that is a good album.
Maybe Angel Dust if I get out.
Angel Dust.
If I get out of bed on at a different angle. But certainly that's 90s Faith No More. It is a completely extraordinary period of like creative flourishing. I think they were a really remarkable band in that time period, from sort of 89 till breaking up in 97, I think.
Something like that, yeah. So again, before we get into necessarily sort of the high theory of talking about metal, I kind of want to talk to you about how you got into metal. Like, what is it about? And it's a very broad question, but what is it about metal that turned you on? And perhaps what was the first gig that you went to that sort of was a watershed moment for you?
Well, it's in terms of what drew me to metal, I suppose there are some there are some typical elements, like that will be kind of common to a lot of people's stories. Some, at least to some degree, some of the kind of the escapist and kind of fantastical dimensions of metal, certainly kind of connected to my teenage imagination, or kind of early in my teenage years. The subversive sort of outlaw energy of metal, the anti-establishment danger of metal, even though it might be something that folks would snigger at now, was certainly something that kind of that drew me in. That sense of darkness, a sense of intrigue, the cathartic dimension of metal for
Mm.
sure. And those themes to relating to kind of social alienation and suspicion of institutions and things like that, again, it really kind of resonated with me as a 12, 13-year-old boy, growing up in a very safe suburban
Same.
environment,
Yeah, yeah.
and my first show was a pretty spectacular one. My dad was kind enough to drive me and a few school friends to go and see Megadeth on a school night. He drove us from the outskirts of Southampton to Poole in Dorset. It's actually where I was born, my hometown in some sense, even though I don't have much memory of living in Dorset.
So you were
Um,
born there and then reborn in metal.
Precisely so. That's my origin story here, right?
Yeah.
So, and what metal itself, right, has its own kind of like mythic origin story with Iommi, kind of Tony Iommi losing the tips of his fingers and kind of
Yes.
relearning how to play the guitar, right? So, um, but which has a mythic dimension as well as kind of speaking to what metal is doing in modernity, right? Because it's a machine accident, a factory accident, which I think is fascinating. Um,
That is fascinating. We can come back to that actually.
yeah,
Mm.
but I saw I saw Megadeth and on the Countdown to Extinction tour when I was maybe 12 or 13 years old, and Pantera. I guess kind of at the height of their powers, or certainly kind of on the very much on the rise at that point,
Mm.
were the support band. Um,
I would have
and
loved
I
to
was
have seen.
actually
I'd love to. Sorry to interrupt. I would love to have seen Pantera. I mean, my word. And Dimebag Darrell. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, as whatever you want to say about Pantera now, and obviously Anselmo is a pretty sort of odious and
Yes.
problematic individual in various senses, but um, they were an astonishing live act at that period and during that period, and I was actually kind of scared
Mm.
by what I saw. I wasn't actually kind of prepared.
Well, in a way, it's sort of job done, isn't it? Like for Pantera. I mean, it's fucking scary music.
Yeah, yeah.
The Decade of Aggression. That's Slayer, isn't it? Decade of Aggression. What's the song? What's the album with the punch on it?
Vulgar display of power.
Vulgar Display of Power. Yeah, I mean that you witnessed the vulgar display of power.
Yeah, yeah, and there was something just like really profoundly kind of visceral
Mm.
about that experience, and as an embodied experience as well. I've never been a kind of a mosh pit champion. Like I'm too weedy for that. But there was something genuinely transformative about being that close to a seething mass of bodies, of being kind of immersed in amplified sound, that kind of simultaneous feeling of community, but also danger,
Mm. Mm.
of being unified, but also being kind of profoundly unsure about the kind of space that I was in.
Mm.
um, that's something that has kind of marked me actually, like in a pretty deep way. That's something that still resonates. It's something that I kind of go back to and revisit a lot in my own mind. So,
I mean, it's comparable to me. I mean, I didn't see such a spectacular concert as my first concert. I think actually my first concert might have been Skunk Anansie, oddly enough.
huh.
And I did actually see Ash as well, if you remember Ash.
Yes, yeah, I
In
do.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
they played in Bristol in can't remember what the venue is called. But it was a very small venue, and they were great, actually, really good.
Hmm.
Like I was really impressed. I've always been impressed by three pieces, you know. Uh, well, I suppose Rush is a good example of that, but like just able to hold stuff together. But I did go to Donington Monsters of Rock
Hmm.
in 1995. And talking about community, like I gave in my little brief skit at the beginning that it was my sister's friends, my older boys,
Hmm.
that they were gods to me, these guys, long hair, they looked like men, and they played guitar, and and they seemed, they smoked and they drank, and they took me to Donington.
Hmm.
And I in no way I felt protected by them. It's like entering a sort of biker gang or something like that. That sort of sense of conviviality. And they all look out for each other. And yeah, and so I saw Sepultura, Metallica were headlining, and I was just in my element then. And that was when they were still moderately cool. And and although I'm not dissing Metallica now, but
Sure, sure.
it's the
What
80s
and
sort of
what
90s.
what would be the point as
Yeah,
well?
yeah, quite.
It's
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we all evolve, don't we? And who else? Slash's Snake Pit was there, which
Well,
was a really good band, actually, I thought.
yeah. Okay. So
And Skid Row, sorry, Skid Row were there as well.
I'm trying to work out. I've never been one for big outdoor festivals.
Mm,
It's
mm,
something for a variety of reasons, actually, some health reasons. I find big outdoor festivals a little challenging, and I'm much more at home in a kind of mid-sized club show.
mm, mm.
But once in my life, I went to Donington Monsters of Rock, prior to it being sort of rebranded, reinvented as Download. Um, and I'm trying to figure out the year now, but it was Ozzy and Kiss headlining,
Okay.
so like traditional headliners.
Mm.
But it was the year that Sepultura played without Max,
Ah, okay.
because I think his son was sort of tragically killed in some kind of a car accident from memory. And there was, a question about whether Sepultura could perform at all,
Mm,
and
mm.
in the end, Andreas did the vocals. And I remember
Andreas is the drummer or the bassist?
the guitar player,
Oh,
actually.
okay, okay, okay. Mm.
Um, and I remember that just being kind of spine-tingly emotional, with Max, with news of what had
Mm.
happened to Max and his family being kind of, filtering through the crowd.
Was this
Uh,
before Roots came out?
I think it was just after Roots.
Because that was a bit of a change, wasn't it, of their trajectory and their sound. I remember listening to it thinking, wow, I don't recognize this, but it's still Sepultura, but it's like much more Brazilian.
Absolutely, and,
Yeah.
and in a sense, I suppose them absorbing some influences from new metal, and the Ross Robinson production, and but yeah, I remember seeing Fear Factory.
Ah, I saw Fear Factory in Bristol as well. I remember
Yeah.
like I was really sniffy at the time about like electronic stuff. I was like a
Mm.
bit of a purist. And I thought, I'll go along with it. And it's like drum machine, but there was also a drummer there. And I actually the live show was just extraordinary.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
Okay, so I didn't realize that we've both been to a Monsters of Rock. There must be like a couple of years between those two
Yeah,
festivals.
it'd be interesting to find out. It sounds like you're describing like Kiss and who else was it?
Ozzy.
Ozzy. So it sounds like you're describing something that might have been prior to 1995, but then I don't know. I suppose they could headline anytime, couldn't they? Really. But that's a classic. Let's see that, and yeah. So as I said on my bill as well, were on my bill was Skid Row,
Mm.
Sebastian Bach. Way back then still. And he was an extraordinary performance actually. But yeah, Metallica were just. I mean, they were just amazing. I was so excited, and I worshipped and still do in some ways Kirk Hammett, and to the extent that one of my guitars that I've got is an old acoustic of no fixed brand. But I wrote Gibson on the top of it in pen ink, and I also did the Metallica logo, but like signed it as if Kirk Hammett had signed it. I was looking at that
That's
this morning.
that's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, I mean that sort of 80s Metallica, Master of Puppets, Justice for All. That those were kind of the pinnacle for me. And I don't think I've ever grown out of that. Although I have been listening to Periphery recently, which is a very different genre, but I do like Periphery. um, yeah. So why am I talking to you, Sam? Well, one of the reasons I wanted to get started, not just because he's got so much information and a brilliant knowledge of metal and the people that produced albums as well. That impressed me. Who was that guy that produced the Fear Factory album?
Well, Ross
Sepultura.
Robinson produced Roots, and he was that. kind of for a brief period developed that sort of signature sound around. I think the early Korn records were Ross
Okay.
Robinson produced.
I'm just looking around actually because I brought a few of my LPs for you. Obviously, I have lots of CDs, but I've got a signed Napalm Death record here, which
Oh wow.
I'm very impressed with. I'd forgotten it was signed. But this is it this White Zombie era that was Ross. What's his name?
Ross Robinson. That I don't know. He could well have been involved in.
So this is I'm showing Sam Electric Head Part Two. This is a single, an EP or single with double whatever. Um anyway, it doesn't matter. But yeah, I've got a White Zombie record here called Electric Head Part Two, The Ecstasy. Looking very White Zombie.
It's a great cover.
Yeah. I was never really into it, but they were the first to sort of pioneer the sort of seven string kind of, and deep, arguably the pioneer of, well, I don't know, it's not pioneer of gent, but a pioneer of the sort of deep, dark, like. Well, tell me about what did White Zombie pioneer?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, they're never really one of sort of my bands, although I did, I did listen to them. I suppose actually, yeah, that incorporation of some kind of electronic
Yeah.
industrial elements without being, they're not an industrial metal band. Even kind of dance
Yeah,
elements.
yeah, yeah.
It's sort of kind of EDM elements to some degree, like the creative use of like movie samples, the kind of prefiguring what Rob Zombie would sort of become in terms of like the horror genre, and kind of, they're an interesting band because they're sort of adjacent as well to a lot of like 90s alt rock, to Jane's Addiction and the
Jane's Addiction,
Tool
yeah.
and Primus and Chili Peppers, Faith No More, Rage Against the Machine, etc. A lot of bands that wouldn't necessarily be kind of classified as metal with a capital M.
Being Caught Stealing was a Jane's Addiction song, wasn't it?
Yeah, and White Zombie are sort of in an interesting position, I think, kind of in relation to like mainstream metal at that time and kind of like 90s alternative experimentation.
The only sort of genre of metal I never really got on with, well, there's tons that I don't know about, but it was new metal. I could never get into that, and I was always a bit sniffy about it because I sort of thought, well, Rage Against the Machine were doing that before any of you,
Sure.
and but Tom Morello. I mean, I follow Tom Morello on Instagram actually. I mean, he still is still a huge force for good, actually, political good, and also his work with Chris Cornell. I mean, in Audioslave. I mean, that band. I was listening to them recently and weeping, because they're so good, and of course because of Chris Cornell. Which for those of you who are listening don't know, Chris Cornell was the singer and primary songwriter of Soundgarden, who sadly died a few years ago. But he also had worked in what's called a super group called Audioslave. And who did Audioslave feature? So it was Tom Morello from Rage.
I think it was basically Rage Against the Machine, the band minus Zach.
Right, I see. Oh, okay.
With Chris Cornell on vocals. I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it works, doesn't it? I mean, for me anyway, it really works. I mean, they're extraordinary albums. So I could talk to Sam like this for days, but I do want to segue really into sort of another reason I wanted to talk to Sam, which is that Sam has written about and thought about music in relation to literature for a number of years. I mean, you've got kind of broad. Well, tell us about your kind of broad research, Sam, and then perhaps you can sort of introduce sort of how you've been thinking about metal in relation to literature or literary theory.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Okay. In terms of what you might describe as my card carrying specialism, things that have kind of defined my academic career such that it is to date, and things that kind of tend to sort of dominate what I teach. And I'm a specialist in modern and contemporary US fiction. primarily the American literary novel, from 1960s to the present. So I suppose if I'm known for anything, it's probably in niche academic circles for my work on the US novelist Thomas Pynchon.
Yep.
The big news recently about Pynchon kind of bequeathing decades of notes, letters, manuscripts to the Huntington Library in Los Angeles.
Oh, I didn't know that. Fantastic.
Which is
wow.
really intriguing.
Is there any embargo on any of that stuff?
Apparently not. No, that I think it will be available in the Huntington within a few years.
My word.
From what I've been told,
there'll be queues out the door.
Absolutely. But I'm a Pynchon specialist, and that interest in Pynchon as the kind of like foundation to what I do has led me in all kinds of different directions. Pynchon famously sort of combines challenging literary experimentation with a kind of engagement with kind of popular genres in various ways, and Pynchon famously incorporates all kinds of musical references and musical materials in his fiction. So kind of working on Pynchon in a sense gave me the confidence to take this kind of long-held interest in music forward into a more kind of formal academic framework. And eventually, like having kind of played around with the ideas for many years, I committed to starting to seriously research the relationship between metal and literature. That ultimately is going to become what I hope is a book, a big project that is provisionally titled Feels Like Hell. Lady Lazarus reference there. Mm-hmm. Feels Like Hell, metal music and modern American literature. That's the book length project I'm working on right now. But I've already started to sort of explore some of the ideas that I'm going to take forward in that book with some shorter pieces. Mm. And I suppose the thing that interests me most right now, or certainly in terms of what I've published on the subject so far, is what I would describe as the kind of unrequited love affair between metal and the literary, in the sense that from the very beginnings of metal music as we know it, from the beginnings of heavy metal through to the present day, you have a form of music typically typically thought of, at least in some circles, as anti-establishment, as even degenerate. On some level, it can be characterized in that way. A music associated with kind of moral panic, a music associated in some circumstances with kind of thuggery, right? With a kind of there's a knuckle dragging quality to metal, at least in terms of how it's characterized or mischaracterized, and yet. Metal is kind of borrowing from, processing, high literary source materials, mm-hmm. from its point of origin all the way through to to what's happening in contemporary metal culture, and that's one of the things that I was kind of really drawn to, is the weird way in which the literary world doesn't really kind of speak back to metal in the same way that it does in the case of punk or in the case of hip hop, which are comparable styles of music because of that association with a kind of anti-establishment danger, or with youthful rebellion, etc., etc. Obviously, I'm painting in really kind of broad strokes here, but folks are comfortable describing, a writer like Kathy Acker, for instance,
Yeah.
as a punk figure. And there's no, there's all kinds of academic work on kind of, hip hop poetics, or, the poetics of grime and so on and so forth. And that sort of interplay, if you like, between kind of, lyrical performance and poetics that you get from hip hop. But with metal, the literary world, as I say, is not kind of speaking back to a form that is nonetheless kind of besotted with it.
Yeah.
And that kind of tension is something that I found really fascinating.
Yeah, and I'd like to. A lot of those ideas are articulated in an essay that I'd like to talk to you a little bit more in a bit. The Devil's Party: Metal and Literature. By the way, I have to say about, and your title feels like hell, which is the Plath illusion, right? And but also in this article you talk about an artist called Katz, something Katz, who
Cats, yeah.
But what I was going to say, the first thing I was going to say is that some of the there needs to be a list of these just to make people laugh. I love some of the stuff, the subtitles of and titles of metal, literary metal things, like Ernest Hilbert's Poet in the Pit, Slayer Heavy Metal. What was it? Some of the other ones. Rhyme of Rhyme of the Metal Mariner. I mean, this is brilliant. I mean, that's fantastic. And there are other sort of awesome sort of puns, and I wonder whether that's something. But I do want to come back to that. But first of all, like, I suppose, like, we've jumped before, perhaps. If we've got some definitions, right? You talked about the origins of metal, and I like that notion of Tony Iommi being kind of damaged by metal, as it were, and then fighting back and producing. And you describe, I want to talk to you about how you describe metal in a little bit, but you describe the sort of the way in which Black Sabbath developed their style and sound. But in like a sentence, Sam, if you could. What is it you and I mean if we mean the same thing? And what is it we mean by metal? And what is it you think other people hear when we say metal?
Wow. I mean, I wonder if it is. I think I've sort of used this phrase casually in the past, like, and it's something I'd like to kind of take forward actually and extend. But some notion of the grammar of metal, like the kind of the fundamental kind of units of metal, and I think that would actually, tying it back to the origin story, tying it back to Iommi, tying it back to literally the ways in which he had to kind of relearn how to play guitar, and with the synthetic caps on his fingers giving him a new kind of string bend, the sound of the tritone. I think we're talking about the riff, right? Well, or at least the power chord, the amplified power chord, like the basic kind of unit, like the building block, the building blocks of heavy metal. I think that's where I'd go first.
Yeah,
that's certainly not a coherent sentence that you asked me for, but does that kind of tally
it does.
with you?
It does, because I think what you could have done, you could have gone one of two ways in that question. And I wasn't anticipating the way you did go, but actually I think that's a better way of going it, certainly in terms of the platform of our foundation of our conversation, because you could have tried to define metal in terms of its genres or its split off genres, which of course now we know that there's hundreds if not thousands of split off metal, and there's a great site, I don't know what the site is, you'll probably know it online, where it's like the Metal Encyclopedia or something, where you've got these, what's it called, do you know?
Well, there's Encyclopedia Metalum.
That's fantastic.
And there's also Map of Metal, which is really good as well, where it literally kind of visualizes, maps all of the kind of subgenres.
And there's stuff in there like Scandinavian black dark thrash death or something, which and
Yeah,
I'm like,
yeah,
whoa,
yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
it actually reminds me of the ways in which literally, like you talk a lot about this in the beginning of this article, and we mentioned prior to this recording that you were interested in genre and how genre informs your
Mm,
understanding. And I too am interested in genres and styles and how styles develop. And those maps of metal bands or genres remind me of maps that people have drawn of like radical experimental poetry, like the London School, the kind of
yeah.
Oulipo, Cambridge School, and all that kind of
Mm,
stuff. It's very very broad brush, but in a sense they provide a sort of shorthand. But the implication is, as the sort of as you were implying in what you're saying, is that each of those phrases implies a sort of a grammar in and of itself, but a grammar that has developed as an offshoot or a rhizome, I suppose you could call it,
mm,
of an original poetic grammar
mm,
that is experimental poetry or that
mm,
is metal. And I like the way I was trying to find that phrase that you wrote, and you've already said the word about the tritone driven menace of the
mm.
self-titled Black Sabbath album. And I love that because that's such a beautiful description of it, and that's you're right. And so he develops this tritone. So I think in this article, so I was trying to establish what metal is, and I think you started sort of thinking about, let's say maybe like a poetics of metal or sort of, and but also it's in a reciprocal relationship or a non-reciprocal relationship with literature. So
Yeah,
in this article, I'm going to read the if you forgive me. So am I allowed to, is this published now? uh,
yeah, yeah. It is published. Yeah.
so this article is published in the Routledge Companion to Music and Modern Literature, edited by Rachel Durkin, published by Taylor and Francis Group, 2022, and a copy. I think, is it out? Is it? It's not available yet, is it? It's
No, it is available. Yeah.
Oh, it's available. So forgive
Yeah.
me. So this article. So this is what I'm quoting from. This is Sam's, and I'll put in the show notes to this. I'll do a description of this. But in your outro, which of course is a great thing
Mm,
to put in the end of your article, you say this: engaging with literary metal means engaging with enduringly complex questions about value, reception, allusion, influence, and genre. It means adding layers to the ongoing study of musical narrative and poetics. It means deepening and diversifying aspects of cultural history. It means forging dynamic connections between artists working in and across different contexts and media.
mm.
Now, so what I like about this article is, as you say, you're setting out the groundwork for a kind of broader project. But I'm really interested in the sort of, let's say, this kind of sociology of metal that you're kind of drawing from here, and also the ways in which um, you outline the ways in which, as you say, there's a non-reciprocal relationship, and it seems to be that the implication that you've drawn out in past writing about literature and metal
Mm.
is that it's a bit of a pastime that people should be embarrassed about. Like, it's
Sure.
not a serious genre, and I'm interested in that difference between, like, punk is taken seriously, isn't it? Like punk aesthetic.
Yeah.
Whereas metal aesthetic sounds, even to me saying that, I kind of know what I'm talking about. It does sound a bit embarrassing. I don't know why.
Absolutely, or even abject,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
potentially. And
Is it because, is it associated with juvenility or adolescence or something?
I think that's a big part of it. I don't think it's all of it, but that definitely kind of plays a significant role.
Mm.
If you think back through metal's history of censorship and transgression, and again, I've mentioned its association with kind of moral panic.
Mm.
Um,
Was it Thin Lizzy? Was it Thin Lizzy that went to court and had to talk about why they're talking about surgery or something?
Yeah, well, and a whole series of metal bands have
Yeah.
appeared in court, from Slayer to
Mm.
Judas Priest,
Mm.
or to the lighter end of Twisted Sister.
Twisted
Like
Sister, that's right.
Dee Snider famously kind of appearing in the Senate hearings
Yeah, that's right.
around
Yeah,
the
that's the one I was thinking of.
PMRC, that era,
Mm.
along with kind of figures from punk like Jello Biafra, and but that there is an association, yes, with kind of with moral danger when metal is taken very kind of seriously, if you like, and all the satanic panic stuff, and the infernal dimension of metal, its kind of potentially kind of corruptive or corrosive influence on young people. But then there's also that dismissal of metal as something that is, for the young, something that you should kind of grow out of,
Mm.
something that is at best, as it were, kind of an outlet for adolescent rage.
Yeah, a phase. I was
Yeah,
often said when I was younger. Yeah, yeah.
absolutely, and and I still sort of navigate that in terms of my own kind of day-to-day personal and professional life. Or I weigh up the situation before
Mm.
before I sort of admit, as it were,
Mm.
then that I'm a metalhead.
Coming out as a metalhead, or as Dina Weinstein writes, egghead banger, which I thought is
Yeah,
a fantastic egghead banger, which I thought I think it sounds mildly derisory, but actually I'm happy to be an egghead banger.
likewise,
Yeah,
likewise, yeah,
yeah.
and so there's that association with juvenility, with vulgarity,
Mm.
with a kind of an unseriousness, with a kind of for all the technical flashiness of some kind of schools or subgenres of metal, and that is one of the kind of primary ways in which metal tends to be distinguished from punk,
Mm.
for all the ways in which you can blur those genres, and for all the ways in which their histories are intertwined
Mm.
in quite quite profound ways that are still kind of underestimated. I think metal's technical proficiency is again weirdly sort of dismissed,
Mm.
and as something that um, is outside of the kind of the framework of kind of cultural seriousness and nourishment.
Yeah, I mean,
That
this is something. A couple of things that interest me about that. Talking about proficiency, one of the things that I always admired about and why I wanted to play guitar, and as soon as I could, I built up the foundations. Was learning, for example, Kirk Hammett from Metallica's solos and stuff, like trying to get that proficiency into my fingertips. Um, but one of the things I've always why I've always defended metal is like it's really intricate, it's really technical, it's really proficient. And then when it goes up to sort of prog metal, like Dream Theater or stuff like that, I mean, these guys are just like super gods of their instruments. And then I mean, it's just preposterous. You get these sort of 16-year-olds in prog rock bands now that have learned everything they need to know on YouTube, and they are just prodigies. They're just extraordinary. But and that really interests me, the paradox that metal sits in, which is serious technical proficiency that is not taken seriously. And I think, like, as in it's too aggressive.
conservatoire levels
Yeah, yeah.
of technical
I mean,
proficiency.
yeah, literally
Yeah.
they go to, and what's it, New York, what's that school in New York that John Petrucci went to?
Oh, I'm having a blank as well,
Yeah,
but I
it's
know
really
exactly what
not
you mean.
Juilliard. It'll come back to us, but
Yeah,
yeah, that place.
yeah.
Um, and yeah, but it's sort of seen as like a circus music in some ways. In fact,
Hmm.
Dream Theater has like circus in it. And you mentioned in your article stuff about the high campness and stagecraft of metal.
Mm.
And but I've always sort of seen those two things not as oxymoronic or paradoxical or contradictory. I've always seen them as part, like a flourish by Petrucci, or a brilliant run by Steve Vai or something like that. Or
Mm.
these are highly serious things, but they're also play, and they're also
Yeah.
and and so these two things don't aren't to me, they're not paradoxical, but for
Mm.
some reason they're dismissed. And I wonder, I think you allude in your article that you alluded to earlier on uh, Blood on the Tracks, Pinch and Bleeding Edge, and unpopular music from
Mm.
Britney to black metal, you allude to like some of Adorno's arguments about the sort of popular culture and how he wrestled, how he dismissed popular culture, but actually we need to reread that as a sense in which actually he extolled a lot of it in many ways,
Mm.
but thought it was being misread or
Mm.
misconstrued. And I do think that there's a misreading of metal, which is like a very sophisticated, how do we put it, like conveyor of cultural paradoxes,
Yeah.
which it and it presents as quite difficult and as in many ways really aggressive, literally aggressive, and so it provides a sort of almost the impenetrable autonomous zone in that Adorno is describing. But and a lot of people can't get into that. They sort of can't get past the sort of extreme avant-gardism of it. But then it's not treated seriously as an avant-garde practice. It's full of paradoxes.
Absolutely, and I think now there are examples of, there are certain bands. I suppose that the real kind of like paradigm case here would be Sun. SU.
I don't know Sun.
And named after a particular type of amplifier. So it's Sun, SUNN, then with a silent 0 and a series of parentheses after them.
Okay.
But I'm reliably informed it's just pronounced Sun.
Okay.
And they're a duo, a kind of doom metal duo who play a kind of extraordinary amplified volume. That one of the loudest live bands on the planet.
Now Motorhead of
sure. Real kind of shaking the foundations of the building stuff, and their music is it's taking the power chord, the basic kind of unit of metal, the essence of metal that we were kind of talking with, and stretching it out into these kind of like pulsating drones that can last for minutes on end. So you have kind of ferocious doom-laden heavy metal becoming a kind of sort of ambient soundscape experience, with the riff, as it were, stretched out to extraordinary extremes. We're just two guys in hoods, like just black robes, a huge stack of amplifiers and two guitars. And Sun are now in a place where they will play galleries, or they will play performance spaces that might be putting on avant-garde classical music, jazz, choral singing, etc., etc. They've got coverage in underground metal publications, but also in The Guardian or The Wire, or etc., etc. So there are examples now of bands who are starting to kind of like blur those distinctions, I think, but those distinctions are tenacious. They're like they stay with us and reverberate quite powerfully. I think, they're difficult to kind of shake off. So,
I mean, my immediate instinct to your description of Sun is to use the word, being fetishized by the art market, as it were.
Right.
And you get that in experimental poetry. Like the only way in which the sort of radical, like post late modernist kind of avant-garde practices that I enjoy and write about and think about and produce in some ways, the only outlet it has for that is a very small kind of group of people giving each other pamphlets, and occasionally someone will break through. But the only outlet for other experimental poetry, which is pretty much doing the same thing but looks different, is in art within art schools, and then it seems to get funding. But then what happens is the consumers of it are very different. They're not the underground consumers. They're not the radical kids like really into death metal or doom metal, what have you. They're consumers of middle class art, like in the sort of, oh, isn't this interesting, this power chord. They don't necessarily know the history of how Sun got to where they got, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but that seems to be a sort of almost like a crossover act you're describing, to one that becomes palatable because it's put up alongside art, is put alongside other avant-garde music, like technical classical music, or
Mm.
even artwork,
Mm.
that is abstract. And that's the thing with poetry as well. You often get really radical poetry that's never watched by anyone, but you get really radical art, plastic art and figurative art,
Mm.
that is, goes for millions. And that really confuses me. And it's somehow like, I think metal, I'm not
That's
suggesting,
fascinating, Gareth. I think, yeah,
well, I'm
really,
not
really,
suggesting that some do that deliberately. My point, what you're describing
yeah.
seems to be like a band that has inadvertently perhaps crossed over into a sort of curated curio,
Mm.
which is a great thing in many ways, but in other ways it's doing something different. I was thinking about what you're saying about and that reminds me of Adorno's description of sort of how artworks will try to be autonomous, then they will become fetishized, and then
Mm.
almost end up what I think he says. I'm quoting Gillian Rose on Adorno here. The same disastrous patterns, which means they get fetishized.
Right, 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 right.
Um,
Yeah.
and but I don't know what I'm going with that. My sort of point. I'm still really curious as to why, for example, the music you're describing sounds just amazing.
Mm.
But to me, that would be like an extreme metal, like not extreme metal as in speed metal,
Mm.
but an extreme metal as an extreme version of metal. Whereas
Yeah.
to me, like, I still, for example, I don't know, take uh, Metallica's Master of Puppets, right?
Right.
So as a watershed, brilliant album, which for me is one of the most staggering albums of the 80s.
Mm.
Very brilliantly well done, excellent songwriting, brilliant musicianship, quite well produced, and that still has that sort of 80s edge to it.
Mm.
Now, there's one. I'm going to segue into something now, which is about lyrics. So to me, I've always taken that album very, very seriously, but somehow in the back of my head, I'm always like, well, where does it fit in terms of high art? But that's not because I'm being snobby and like saying there's high art, low art, which is arguable, and also a set of cultural conditions creates those
Mm.
hierarchies. But also, like, I sort of think, and sometimes when I'm thinking poetics and when I'm thinking about literature, I then sort of think, okay, where do we derive our sense of value? And you mentioned this in your article about how Eric, I think, who's the person? It's some guy talking about, Ernest Hilbert, who
Yeah. Yeah.
he said, this is really interesting. He says metal has never boasted of Bob Dylan and Warren Zevon. And you quite rightly say, um, why do these figures like Dylan and Warren Zevon, why have they acquired the cachet as wordsmiths via highly contingent value systems?
Sure.
And it's the same that could be said for I don't know what's his name from the Smiths, Batman.
Morrison.
Yeah, Morrison, about like he's got this cachet about being a wordsmith. But
Mm.
why doesn't that happen to James Hetfield, right? And
Mm.
I would say, and to be cruel, I would say that I don't think James Hetfield lyrics are great.
No, no,
Uh,
I don't either,
yeah,
actually.
and to be honest, if I'm really honest about it, I don't. Even though I'm profoundly into poetry and language and what have you,
Mm.
I rarely listen to metal for lyrics.
Mm.
That's just my experience. And so I think it's because I'm just attuned into the guitars and drums mainly.
Mm.
But this is where I'm quite interested in. How do we talk about metal lyrics? Like, you discuss some fantastic lyrics in this by artists such as, was it a pig
Pig Destroyer.
which I've
Yeah.
been listening to recently. Like,
Yeah.
I listened to on your recommendation, and fantastic. And who else do we have? Is it Cats?
Cats and
Yeah,
their work in a couple of different bands, Salome and in Agoraphobic Nosebleed as
yeah,
well.
and their work sounds absolutely amazing, and really, really interesting. And so what you're saying is, so this is where we come to literature. So James Hetfield is influenced by H.P. Lovecraft. I mean, they've got a song called Call of Cthulhu,
Sure.
and but his lyrics are not great. They're not. I mean, when I say not great, they're. I mean, I don't think they're designed to be. But like, I mean, some of the lyrics on Black are quite good, like of Wilful Men
Mm.
and stuff like that. I think he wrote a lot of those lyrics in a tent somewhere, didn't he? He
Mm.
was like listening to the sound. Like he went back to his hunter gatherer roots. But he's not a great lyricist. So I had an idea when I was about 20 years ago that I was going to write an serious academic paper on carcass lyrics, right? And
Sure, sure, sure.
I tried to do, and actually carcass lyrics are really interesting, and particularly in
Yeah.
terms of their politics and the sort of necro-politics, you could call
Hmm.
it, you know. And that's it. And I think that could be seriously done. But why don't I do it? And why is it that, as in, what is holding me and perhaps other people back in terms of taking the bare lyrics of metal seriously?
And there's a reason why I was hesitant to commit to what I'm doing now as well, and that, which is perhaps part of what you're describing there. There, I think there is to some degree there is within metal itself, as broad a church as metal might be, as difficult it is, as problematic or dubious as it is to kind of define metal sweepingly as one thing, or as a uniform set of perspectives and practices and opinions. I think within metal itself there is like a kind of an innate hostility like within the genre itself to that kind of like seriousness and that kind of kind of critical engagement, as well as outside there's a sense in which what we're talking about is kind of antithetical to metal.
Yeah, I wonder. I imagine like band metal. Like, I imagine Phil Anselmo. We're not going to talk about Phil Anselmo. Imagine James Hetfield sitting and listening to us.
Sure.
I mean, I think he'd be flattered in a way, but I think he'd be like, "Oh yeah, whatever," like. Yeah. So is that what you're describing? That kind of.
Yeah. To some degree, or that that there are. It's complicated, I think, because in other areas of metal, what might be described as pretension,
yeah,
is welcomed, embraced, and it is actually kind of like part of the fabric of what part of some metal bands kind of define themselves, as it were, around a sense of cerebral seriousness.
Well, Tool and Tool heads, like Tool fans. I mean,
right.
That that it's all like they're sort of entering the like unisphere of like theory and what have you, aren't they?
Yeah, so I think we have to be kind of careful about like where lines are being drawn here, but absolutely, I do understand what you're getting at, and I mean, of course, there are issues in terms of decontextualizing lyrics.
Yeah,
Hetfield is not a great wordsmith, not a great lyricist, but his lyrics can work fantastically.
Oh, they do. And he's brilliant at rhythm, and the sort of scansion is amazing.
Absolutely, in the context of Metallica songs, right? And they are often supremely functional, and I mean that as a very high compliment, actually.
Yeah. I mean, they're extraordinary. Him and Lars are extraordinary songwriters. Extraordinary.
Right.
Still are.
Absolutely, I agree. For all the ways in which Metallica can be kind of wince-inducing, and and that there are parts of Some Kind of Monster that are funnier than Spinal Tap in their way.
Yeah.
And of course there are missteps in their career, but
did anyone say Saint Anger? I actually quite like Saint Anger, weirdly enough.
But those first four records are undeniable, I think.
And also what's the term? Unsurpassable.
Yeah. Absolutely. So it's difficult. I'm losing my train of thought now.
Well, maybe I can bring us back, because this is the sort of second, the next, the follow-up point I was going to make, and perhaps when we should probably sort of draw to an end after this, actually, just because we're probably begging the indulgences of our listeners. Not that we are, you know what I mean. But I wonder then, and you allude to this in a few pockets of your essay, and I think your essay is very much a kind of over summary essay, and you're in it. You are going to go into a lot more detail and a lot more rigorous detail, and that's the point of this essay, isn't it? An overview.
Absolutely, it's a sort of introductory piece, and kind of setting up a field, really.
And it sets up a whole range of fields like really, really well. Ones that I would actually like to actually talk to you off air, as it were, about contributing to, because this fascinates me. But I wonder whether one of where is it? Let me find it. It is talking about, one of the critics talks about the affective range of music. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, they're talking about
Catherine Ferns.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So they're talking about Mastodon's Leviathan, which I've been listening to now, and I listened to this prior to speaking to you. I hadn't heard it before, and how you describe it is awesome. You know, the sort of, you say the structural use of tempo, arguably mirroring the novel. The Mastodon's Leviathan is a sort of concept album, as it were, or a version using Moby Dick. Melville's Moby Dick. So you say the structural use of tempo arguably mirrors the novel's combination of narrative, dynamism, and drift. The bravura drum fills of Brandaler, which are superb on this album. Actually, I recommend everyone to listen to Mastodon's Leviathan. Could be metaphorically linked to Melville's evocations of ocean storms. Now, I like the tentativeness of this in your analysis, because it's like you're kind of, could be tentative, you know, can we do that? But actually listening to it, I think you're right. But, and the but is a follow-up rather than a contradiction. I think maybe what would be really fruitful to talk about metal is not necessarily is as a block of stuff, like, you know, as in lyrics, song, tone, structure, and without extracting the lyrics, because as you say, that's decontextualizing. You're not talking about literature, you're not talking about literature text. We're talking about an effective aesthetic dimension with all its constituent parts as part of it. So you can
absolutely, that's brilliant, Gareth. I really sort of appreciate you drawing that out, actually, because that's one of the things that I very consciously want to sort of avoid going forward, is the analysis of lyrics kind of exactly as you say, decontextualized or somehow kind of surgically removed from the thing that they kind of belong to, that they are a part of, and that comes with kind of quite significant challenges, I think, when it comes to sort of methodology.
How do you what are your examples? Yeah, go on.
No, please.
Well, no, I mean, I'll let you speak now, but one of the things that I was really interested in this article, just as a sort of sub-interest really, was the brilliant tentativity but beauty of the way that you describe metal. Some of the phrases, I've highlighted a number of them, which I really enjoyed. I'll just read them. Tritone-driven menace, as I said, of Black Sabbath's album. Distinctive gallop. Now then you're talking about Iron Maiden. This is such a good description of Iron Maiden. Distinctive gallop, in inverted commas, which is always describing Iron Maiden, isn't it? Of their rhythm section, hummable dual guitar harmonies and soaring quasi-operatic vocals. That is basically, if you said that to any metal fan, you'll be like, that's Iron Maiden with Bruce Dickinson, not Blaze Boylan. And then what is it? Pig Destroyer, songs are often lasting less than a minute. Their music is typically propelled by a dissonant staccato framework, blast beat drums, and tormented bellowing. You talk about the adversarial difficulty of modernist aesthetics and how that might relate to some of this sort of stuff. And with regards, what's the band you're talking about? Sorry, forgive me. You might be able to tell me. Maelstrom of polyrhythmic drumming, atonal guitar passages,
Portal.
Yes, I mean, this is that they were fascinating. I was listening to them earlier. So you say about this band Portal, with their maelstrom of polyrhythmic drumming, atonal guitar passages, murky, monstrous growls, Portal have journeyed far beyond the minor chord spookiness that characterizes more conventional tributes to the horror writer, i.e. H.P. Lovecraft, to the extent that their work is described, as you say, and as others say, as Lovecraftian. Now, with Lovecraft, we can... I was reading Call of Cthulhu and other weird stories recently, and this story... was it Dagon? And you can describe, you can illustrate, or you can describe the effective dimension of his creations by analyzing the text. With Portal, you have to describe those affective aesthetic dimensions, but not just relying on the text, but relying on the text as one other feature. And so therefore I think there's what you're working on, I think, which is really exciting, is very literally finding an academic or an aesthetic style to write about metal.
That's what I'm ultimately hoping to do. Yeah, that's my kind of underlying aim. And the vast majority. I mean, there is some outstanding scholarship on metal that has been for a long time, actually. But what's called metal studies, for all the ways in which that in itself again is a very sort of broad church. Metal studies has its origins in sociology.
Yeah.
And the methods, the ways in which metal tends to be discussed in an academic framework is sociological. And what I would like to do is really take forward in an extended critical framework, something that will kind of answer, if you like, the questions we've been kind of wrestling with today. Is how do you write about the aesthetics of metal, about the substance and texture and kind of nuance of metal, the interactions between its kind of component parts, its constituent parts. Something that exists at a kind of textual level in terms of influence, reference point, allusion, lyric sheets, etc., but also something that is actually that's felt in your body.
Yeah,
as well.
And
that's.
Yeah, I mean, that goes back full circle to what we were talking about our experience. And that lots of people with genres, I'm sure people with, they're interested in Bhangra or they got into, rap at a young age or what have you, that it sort of gets in them. And I think we've described that experience of that excitement, affective embodiment that metal gives us. And perhaps it's one of the reasons I listen to, as I was saying, I was listening to recently Periphery, which is this sort of really interesting, where they're from the States, aren't they? Kind of,
I think so.
Yeah. But they're amazing writers and songwriters. But I listen to the music. I just enjoy the intricacy of the music rather than things. But it gets me into this zone, and I find myself getting happy and excited and stimmy in my kind of autistic way about this sort of music. And yeah. So, but I think what perhaps this field of study, as it were, which as you say, there are many other people who have written about this stuff. What it needs, if the literature is going to be part of it, it needs the methodology and expertise of literary critics or people that are interested in literature, but also resistance to maybe sociological ways of thinking about it, also resistance to philosophy. I mean, I don't like the sort of, but don't necessarily don't like them, but like stuff like the philosophy of Metallica or philosophy of, because what tends to happen when philosophy meets poetry is that philosophers use poets, but they don't talk about the intricacies of poetic form. They talk about in other words, they talk about meaning rather than form. And I think this, maybe you might think that I'm being wrong-headed about this, but I think what you are talking about or trying to talk about is the form, the grammar, the poetics of metal.
Absolutely, and there's another kind of layer of complexity to that, in the sense that just looping back to the problem of analyzing metal lyrics in a kind of decontextualized way, the lyric sheet, the lyrics on the page, as it were, even though there are examples that I explore in that piece of metal lyrics that are also kind of designed to function as standalone poetry, but by an artist like Cat Katz, who is sort of consciously positioning themselves like on a kind of border, if you like, between writing for performance and writing poetry that has this kind of standalone integrity on the page. But when in many cases, whatever kind of craft might go into the creation of metal lyrics, especially in extreme metal or extreme metal subgenres, those lyrics are often delivered in a way that is largely incomprehensible.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Whether that's a kind of a death metal kind of Cookie Monster growl,
Yeah.
or the sort of, a black metal kind of ring wraith shriek, or, and those lyrics, to access those lyrics, if you like, there's this really, really fascinating tension there, I think, between, what's put into the creation of lyrics, and then, in a sense, the kind of their obliteration in performance.
Yeah, the lyrics will consume themselves, but they are a constituent part. So it's almost like fantasy world building in a way, like, and the work is going on in the background. But like, and again, that just speaks to the fact that it all, and that's the other thing is how do you write about an album where you can't actually hear the lyrics? If you can't hear the lyrics, then to all intents and purposes, those lyrics aren't really constituting your understanding of the song as you're experiencing it.
Yeah.
It's only retrospectively that you can look at the lyrics and then make a connection between the semantics of the lyrics and the aesthetic qualities of the song that is also carrying along its own semantics. So there's a really interesting relationship there. That's fascinating, actually, about how do you talk about lyrics that you can't even hear?
Yeah, and it's often a part of, I suppose, in a sense, getting back into sociology here as well, but a significant part of metal fan culture is the lyric sheet.
Yeah.
Still plays that kind of role in a way. That is the lyric sheet long discarded in other kind of popular and unpopular genres.
Yeah.
Especially given that the tie to the physical object. Metal fans' relationship to kind of collecting, etc., etc. The lyric sheet still has a place there, but again, I'm interested in writing about the kind of the critical implications of that, not just the role that plays sociologically in fan culture. So.
Yeah, and that's why it's sort of more aesthetics than sociology, that's important. Sam, I think we need to bring this conversation to a close, but I do want to ask you one last question, which is, I've just thought of, because I was just reading this phrase in your essay, which is, can you tell me, given that you're the expert here, can you tell me what the sludge band thou are, and what is sludge metal?
Oh, wow. Okay. So sludge metal, Thou are an incredible band, actually, who I saw at Supersonic Festival in Birmingham last summer, and they were one of the real kind of highlights of the festival for me. That Thou stand out as well because of the sort of anarchist.
Oh yeah, that's what you say, anarchist sludge
credentials, and
metal.
They're a band who kind of operate as a very much as a collective.
Okay.
But sludge metal. In a lot of cases, there is that sort of association with the US South.
Okay.
The
molasses metal.
Right, yeah, and that sense of, like, the kind of the swamp environments of Louisiana, and somehow sort of being kind of translated into the sound. But sludge metal,
swamp metal, that could be, couldn't it? Swamp metal.
Yeah. But sludge isn't exclusively defined by region, because of course southern metal is also another kind of conversation, in terms where you've got that kind of more the boogie woogie influences coming through, and country kind of making its presence felt in the melodies. But sludge is has that kind of swampy sound. Black Sabbath there as the kind of template in the background, really down-tuned, often a kind of lo-fi production, slow-paced, sometimes kind of tortuously paced, but not doom metal. Like, none of the kind of sludge will not have the kind of trappings of fantasy and escapism. Sludge will often be kind of nihilistic, sardonic. Vocals might be kind of more sort of screechy.
Okay.
And some kind of influence from noise rock, and I suppose, I mean, thinking again of kind of origins, one of my all-time favorite bands, the Melvins,
Mm-hmm.
I think are really kind of important in the development of what's called sludge
Sludge,
metal.
okay.
Yeah, so like that early Melvins sound, which is really important in the birth of grunge,
Okay.
but also hugely influential in terms of the development of metal. So, yeah.
Wow, thank you so much for that. That was really interesting. Again, you're sort of, my head is popping with ideas now, and I will I'll have to check these bands out. So Sam, thank you. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you about your work, and yeah, thank you so much for appearing on Gareth's Whimbox.
Gareth, thanks so much for having me on. Thank you so much for reading my work so closely. I mean, that's a real real honor. I'm really, really grateful for that. And I do hope I was halfway coherent at a difficult point in the term. So.
No, you were. Thank you so much, Sam. And there we go. That was a wonderful interview with Sam Solomon. So great to catch up with him, and I hope you found the conversation with him as enriching as I did. So, thank you for listening to Gareth's Whimbox, episode 7 on metal and literature. Such a brilliant it sounds onto something, and I hope to be part of it. So yeah, thanks. So join me next time on Gareth's Whimbox, and thank you for listening. I'll leave you with the metal version of Gareth's Whimbox. It's Gareth's Whimbox. It's Gareth's Whimbox. It's Gareth's Whimbox. It's Gareth's Whimbox. Gareth's Whimbox. It's Gareth's Whimbox.